All right, this is our summary for Chapter 6. Again, not a complete list of all the concepts, but certainly some of them that I want to emphasize. Chapter 6 talks about the carriage of goods and of people and the different international treaties we've made to regulate those. Again, this is a picture of me sporting my beautiful UCO Bronco jacket at China's Temple of Heaven in gorgeous a temple that's been there for 1,400 years, all made of wood, and just very, very historic, very tourist friendly in China, considering the fact that they obviously speak another language. Very easy to accommodate even somebody that speaks as little Chinese as I do. Other thing interesting about China is a lot of American markets, a lot of American goods are trying to be marketed there. Some of them successful, some of them not successful. For example, one of them that's really struggling is Dairy Queen. Again, they're succeeding in America. The problem is in China, their goods are too sweet for their tastes. The same way with cookies, Nabisco and these. In fact, one of their new products that's coming out in China are what they call Oreo Light, that are basically Oreo cookies with only a third the sugar that the Americans use, because they wouldn't buy them because they thought they were too sweet tasting. And so now they make a version of Oreos that have much less sugar in them, and those are more appealing to the Chinese audience. First, let's talk about the regulations that deal with air care. Right? You ship goods and people through the air. You've got to have treaties, again, international agreements that cover the liabilities of the different parties. When it comes to airlines, we've had two large bills, two large treaties that have been used, starting with the early one, the Warsaw Convention, and then the later Montreal Convention. Now, when is it an international flight? How do you know it's international? Well, actually, it's international. The magic distance is 12 miles. When it's outside of 12 miles of our shoreline, that part's called international. And again, you may notice this if you've taken any flights or voyages on a boat abroad, because once they get into international waters, then perhaps the casino opens or those kinds of things. But while they're in America, they can't do those. And so once they get into international waters, then they're entitled to do those. And so the magic distance is 12 miles. So we come along in 1929 with the idea of international flights. Again, you have to think about the times of 1929. Airline industries were fledgling. Most of the airports in the world had dirt runways. Airline was very much at a subsistence level as far as financially making it. And so very much the Warsaw Convention 1929 protected the airlines, heavily limited their liability in case something went wrong. Again, started out with $25,000 in case of death, but then increased over time, several amendments to it. But certainly then, even now, it's only been amended to $75,000 in case they kill you on an airline, which isn't much liability. Damages to cargo is $10 per pound, which isn't very much as far as coverage for goods. Try to think of all the different items that you have that are more valuable than $10 per pound for weight, and that covers most of them. Now, by the time the Montreal Convention comes along in 1999, the market in airlines have changed. It's no longer the airlines are weak, financially insolvent little businesses that can't afford a loss. Instead, they're the big behemoth business, and we need to protect the consumer. And so the Montreal Convention in 1999 had much stronger protection for the consumer. One of the things they did is dramatically increase the airline's liability in case you get killed or injured. The way that they've done it in the modern convention is that the airline is responsible strictly if you are injured up to $146,000. Basically, it's 100,000 SDRs, special drawing rights. That's the make-believe currency of the International Monetary Fund. We'll talk about that later when we get into the chapter on international banking. But by the terms of the treaty, the Montreal Treaty, it defines the damages as far as in special drawing rights. And so a dramatic increase in the amount of liability the airline has for you in case you get killed or injured. And again, the airline is presumed to be liable for damages in excess of 100,000 SDRs unless it can prove it wasn't their fault that the accident occurred. So the airline may have huge liability in case of an airline wreck. Now, when are they responsible for you? In the magic words, again, the terms of the treaty say, while you're on board the aircraft or while you're embarking or disembarking. Well, how do we know when that is? The magic test that we've used legally is when are you under the control of the airline employees? Now, since 2001, with the terrorist attack, we've dramatically redone how we do airline control and when are you under control of the airline employees. At this point, you're under the direction of the airline employees once you get on the jetway, that little sky bridge that goes from the airport terminal to the airplane, because only people who have a ticket for that exact flight can get on at that point. While you're in the terminal shopping or rolling around and you fall and trip, whoever owns the airport is responsible for you, not the airline. But the minute you get on the jetway, even though you haven't physically gotten on the airplane yet, if you stumble and fall, the airline is responsible for you because you're under their control. Well, what is an accident? And here we've had a lot of litigation on, is it something unique to you or is it something that's caused by the airline? And the book gives you several of these little examples. But again, it's very subjective to define exactly what is something that's unique to you as opposed to, luggage fell on you, or that type of thing. In fact, one that's always noted is the Hussein case. And the idea was the airline had a person, this is back when you could smoke aboard the planes, that was very allergic to the smoke and having a severe reaction, and he asked to move. The stewardess refused to move him. He started having convulsions. The stewardess refused to move him. He started passing out, and the stewardess refused to move him, and finally he died. And it turns out there were 4 other seats on the airplane where he could have moved and been away from the smoke, but the stewardess refused. And there the court said the airline was responsible because it had the opportunity to fix it and did not. So that was considered an accident, even though lots of people were exposed to the smoke and other people weren't injured. The airline was responsible because they knew someone was being injured and did nothing to try to stop it. And of course, in that court opinion, the court mentions multiple times the name of the stewardess who refused to move the person. So I think they were especially outraged by that. What responsibility do they have in addition to in case you die? They also have responsibility for cargo. If you ship things by plane, it's 17 SDRs per kilo. So basically it's about $12 per pound for goods. Again, slightly more than before, but certainly most of the things that you buy are worth more than that. And so as a result, you have to get private insurance to cover those. Your baggage means your suitcases, 1,000 SDRs, or basically $1,500 per person. And again, unless you declare a higher value and then the airline charges you, because basically you're buying a small insurance policy because you're handling goods that are very expensive. The last one was in addition to the Montreal treaty that became, no one noticed at first, but became kind of a sticking point. Because the Montreal Treaty says that the airline is responsible in case of a delay. Now, typically with a delay, it's going to be 3 or 4 hours, and the airline's option was, we'll give you a coupon for $15 so you can go to the local restaurant in the airport and eat, and that settles everything. But in 2010, Iceland had a volcano erupt, large volcano erupt, and as a result, it halted airline travel in Europe, for all of Northern Europe, for about 2 weeks. And that delayed people for a long period of time, not just 3 hours, but some of them were, 5, 10, 15 days before they could get out. And so the problem is that the treaties, all those that were flying internationally, the airline's responsible for all their expenses for that 10 or 15-day delay. So the cost of their hotels for 15 days, the cost of all their food for 15 days, the airlines were responsible for it, regardless of the fact that that's grossly in disproportion to the actual cost of their flight. So they're still actually litigating some of those costs from the 2010 Iceland volcano problem. Because, an airline sells you a ticket for $800 and then ends up getting a bill for $5,000 for your delay losses. And so it's very difficult for the airlines to absorb that. Now, instead of shipping things by air, most of the time that we're talking about shipping goods, it's done by boat, by sea. Historically, it was financially troublesome to ship goods by sea because the contracts always had exculpatory clauses. If you remember those from 3113, that's a clause in the contract that basically says, if something goes wrong, you can't sue me no matter what. And the shipping companies had all the power, and so they put those clauses in there, and it meant anybody's cargo got damaged, you couldn't sue the shipping company no matter what. And so we developed the treaty, the Carriage of Goods at Sea Act, to regulate these areas and to avoid those exculpatory clauses. The problem with it is, again, it's kind of a paper right. It's a right that exists on paper, but in practice, it really doesn't have much use to it. What do I mean by that? Well, the Carriage of Goods by Sea Act has a lot of exceptions. It says the shipper is not responsible if the damages to the goods are caused by one of these things: errors in navigation, perils of the sea, act of God, act of war, seizure, labor riots, quarantine, saving someone else, problems that you didn't pack them very well, or defects in the boat that they didn't know about. And then it goes all the way A through Q. The very last one is the Q clause. And it basically says if the shipping company can identify anybody else's fault for the damages that occurred to your goods, they're not responsible. And so as a practice, all these 17 exceptions make it almost impossible for the cargo owner to sue the shipping company. It's riddled with exceptions. But it actually gets worse than that, because even if you get by the exceptions and what happened to my goods was not caused by any one of these 17 clauses, there's a limitation on how much the shipping company is responsible. $500 per package. And so again, this is looking at your bill of lading. How many packages do you describe on there? And a lot of times if you got sloppy, you may just put in a bill of lading that just describes it as one cargo container. You don't describe it as being 500 televisions inside it. Instead, you just describe it as one cargo container. And so if they push your cargo container over into the ocean, they owe you $500 in response. And so very, very small coverage, regardless of the value of the goods. In fact, a famous case is mentioned in the textbook is that someone was shipping yachts by boat. And since they each had their own bill of lading that said each yacht was one package. And so the fact they jettisoned all these yachts during a storm said that the shipping company had to pay them $500 per yacht that they threw overboard. So very, very little coverage, if any. So what's your conclusion if you're shipping goods? Honestly, you've got to have private insurance. Whether you're shipping goods by airplane, anything that's more than $10 a pound, and honestly, if it's more than $10 a pound, you probably wouldn't, if it's less than that, you probably wouldn't even think about shipping it by airplane. That's all the coverage that you get, and so you'll need private insurance. If it's shipping by boat, you really don't have any coverage at all because COGSA, Carriage of Goods at Sea Act, has so many exceptions, and such limitations that it really doesn't provide any meaningful coverage. And so you've got to have private insurance. It's the only way to protect your goods while they're being transported abroad. While they're on a boat for 6 weeks, a lot of bad things can happen to them. Not just loss, damaged by water, damaged by movement, pilferage, all these kind of problems can happen while they're out of your custody and control for 6 weeks. And you've got to prepare for those losses. And the only way to do it is with private insurance. There really isn't another solution out there.